Well, focus your audio on this and dig it, Daddy-O. That was pretty cheesy. But anyway, this is my introduction to spoken word. And what I'd like to do first is cover the differences between page versus stage poetry. There are significant differences between the two. A lot of people kind of conflate them, but a stage poem, a performance piece, is not quite the same thing as when you read a book poem aloud. So what are these distinctions? Well, the most obvious one is that stage poetry is meant to be performed aloud and not read. But what does that mean? Well, we'll get to that in a second. I'll just share with you a heretical opinion, which is that just as most page poetry does not survive the stage, most stage poetry does not survive the page. This is going to get me into a lot of trouble with purists, but I'll take my chances. Here's a good example of page poetry that couldn't possibly make it on the stage. It's called An End Note, I misspelled that, An End Note in Love Song by Aaron Moray. And like a lot of Aaron Moray's stuff, it's just full of typographical and lexical tomfoolery that makes it quite literally impossible to read aloud. Like, how would you get through the title, or like the subtitle, which is Sonnet 89, sweated by, and that's W. Shakespeare, but written in Cyrillic? Or how would you get through line 12? So this is a page, this is a poem which really is about the structure of a sonnet. It's actually about that. It's about Shakespeare as a sonneteer, and it's about the things that you can do with that sonnet, because it takes lines from the sonnet, rearranges them, plays with them, and things like that. And this is not an isolated incident. You know, this is quite common. If you look at the work of E.E. Cummings or Stéphane Mallarmé, or, you know, so many poets throughout history, a lot of it is meant to be looked at on the page and analyzed and examined as basically a visual item. So performance poetry relies then on a whole bunch of other different things, one of which is memorization. This is actually fairly important. Now, not all performance poets will memorize at all times, but the vast bulk of them do, because just as in a play you'd expect the actors to know their lines, you come to expect performance poets to know theirs. Performance poetry differs from page poetry in that there's audience energy and dialogue. You're communicating with the audience, but you're also picking cues up from the audience. Not just visual and verbal cues, but emotional ones as well. So there's an address, but there's also the audience as an interlocutor. Very important. In stage poetry, you're going to be using theatrical, vocal, verbal, and gestural techniques. And whether you've learned these formally or you've intuited them yourself on your own, either way, you are at some point going to rely on these for your delivery. There's often a lot of improvisation in spoken word poetry. Now, not everybody does this. That's actually a very specific subset of techniques that only a very few, very lucky few have ever managed to develop. It's almost unheard of, but you know, those who can do it are absolutely amazing. It'll blow your mind. Again, with my heretical opinion, there's language and tropes that don't work on the page. I don't want to sort of belabor this point too much. This is more of a personal feeling, but I do get the impression that just some things that you can say and ways that you can say them in a spoken word piece, that if you were to write them down on the page, I don't think would be quite as successful. If you want to know about those, I'll discuss those in person. And one of the most important distinctions, though, is that the knowledge that you cannot scan or peruse the piece. You've just got one shot to experience the piece, and you're experiencing it hot, live, as it's coming down with a room full of other people. And that's absolutely vital. You may attend a poetry reading and you can sit there in the audience and listen to Margaret Atwood or whoever it is just kind of drone on with her poetry. And you're sharing something, but it's not the same thing as sharing a visual and auditory performance by a performance poet who's getting up there and entertaining the living daylights out of you using a variety of techniques. And you can't go back to this and read it over and take your time over it. You've only got one shot at experiencing it. So there's my reference to Aaron Murray, an endnote and love song on poets.org, and I strongly advise you to look up poets.org. It's a great repository of some of the finest poems in the English language. So that's my little key for the day. And as usual, I'd like to thank David Medill, CFP of BMO Nesbitt Burns, and former library CEO Andrew Armitage for their generous support of the Poet Laureate program, and the Poet Laureate Advisory Committee of the Owen Sound and North Grey Union Public Library. I would like to acknowledge that this video was produced on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, the people of the Three Fires known as the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi Nations. And I give thanks to the Chippewas of Saugeen and the Chippewas of Nawash, now known as the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, as the traditional keepers of this land. So stay tuned for the next video, which is going to be a very brief and very clunky history of spoken word, or rather some of the highlights in the early days of spoken word that sort of got us to where we're at today. So hope to see you for that, and have a good day.